to this session on adaptation planning and processes within the nature-based resilience stream at the APAN Forum. My name is Liz Mullen-Bernhardt, and I'm the coordinator of the Global Adaptation Network, hosted at Unep. It's my pleasure to be moderating and learning from this session today, where we're going to be delving a bit into how nature-based and ecosystem-based approaches can be integrated into, and crucially, how they can support national adaptation planning. And we're going to be doing this by focusing our attention today on the NAP process. We're looking at NAPs as the key adaptation planning document for a country. However, we do realize they are not the only one, and that adaptation, for example, also forms a core component of most NDCs as well. For that reason, we were really pleased to see yesterday in the NBR session on climate governance and policies led by our stream co-leads IUCN, that good discussions are already happening on linking adaptation and mitigation and the role of both NAPs and NDCs in enhancing climate action. Because it's clear that while EBA is valuable in NAPs, it must also be mainstreamed into adaptation and development planning at other national, subnational, and sectoral levels. So in this session today, we'll be looking both at that vertical integration of adaptation planning with real country examples of how they're working from local to national level, as well as the horizontal integration across a number of different sectors that are relevant to NAPs. And for that, we'll be hearing from a few technical experts on specific topics. In doing this, we're hoping to have a conversation with our panelists and also with all of you as participants about how nature-based approaches can help link up multiple processes at national and other levels, but also help to bring together and facilitate those cross-sectoral linkages that are so essential to national climate plans. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Noel just to ask if we are ready to start in the session, if we're ready to go. We have all panelists and participants in this session. So Noel, if you have any announcements, please, over to you.
No, everything is all good. You can begin.
Thank you so much. So we have about 90 minutes with you today and a packed and exciting agenda, as you can see here on your screen. I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we're going to be hearing about and discussing in today's session. And we've also built in some time to have questions and feedback from all of you listening in and joining us today. Let me start by telling you just a little bit about each section of our program and the distinguished guests that we have speaking with us today. First, we'll have a few opening remarks from Ms. Jessica Troney, who's the head of the Climate Change Adaptation Unit at Unep. She'll be speaking about Unep's work supporting countries on adaptation through both NAPs and EBA processes and projects. Then Dr. Paul DeSanker, manager of the Response Subdivision at the Adaptation Division in the UN Climate Change Secretariat, will provide a keynote where he'll give some context and an overview of the importance of the NAP process and where countries are at with their NAPs. After that, we'll have 3 short presentations from our technical experts, and each of these presentations touches on a different aspect or sector of EBA in NAP processes. First, we'll ask Ms. Julie Greenwald from Go Green for Climate to speak about key issues to be considered for integrating EBA into NAP processes. Then we'll have Mr. Alexandre Maybeck at C4, who'll be talking about addressing forestry and agroforestry in NAPs. And our third presentation will be by Ms. Christina Romanelli of the Biodiversity, Climate Change, and Health Unit at WHO, who'll be speaking about the interlinkages of health and ecosystems, including the COVID-19 context and NAPs. And last but not least, at the end of our session and after our country panel discussion, we'll have Mr. Alejandro Jimenez Hernandez, who's an independent EBA consultant at Unep, to present the ongoing work on guidelines for integrating EBA into NAPs. Then in this session, we'll be hearing from 3 distinguished panelists from 3 geographically unique countries that are at different stages in their NAP processes and looking at EBA at various levels. These panelists will share their perspectives and experiences from their countries on how nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches have been integrated into their NAP processes. So we'll be joined in the panel by Ms. Srijana Shrestha, who's the Undersecretary at the Climate Change Management Division in the Ministry of Forestry and Environment and the Nat Coordinator in Nepal. We also have Ms. Jennifer de Brum, who's joining us from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, where she's a project coordinator for the Ridge to Reef project at UNDP. And our third panelist is Ms. Champanut Songkhao, who is an environmental official at the Climate Change Management and Coordination Division in the Office of Natural Resources and Environment Policy and Planning within the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment in Thailand. I'd also like to note that throughout this session, we'll have our Q&A box open the entire time, and I welcome all of you to share your questions to our presenters and our panelists, and we'll do our best to be answering those throughout the session and also open up for some time for dialogue throughout the session. Finally, I'd like to ask all of you to gear up for the Mentimeter breaks that we'll be taking throughout the session. We're not starting Mentimeter now, but I would like to invite you to already get it ready. And you can do so by either going to www.menti.com and entering the code that you see here on your screen, 2130-8972, or you can use your phone's camera to scan the QR code and it'll take you straight to the link. Now, these questions that we have in the Menti are self-paced, so you can start to go through them as you see fit, but we'll be taking different breaks throughout the session to talk through these questions. I am now going to hand over to Ms. Jessica Troney to provide the opening remarks for this session. As mentioned, Jessica heads up the Climate Change Adaptation Unit at Unep and has under her oversight all of the programming related to international climate funds in the Ecosystems Division at Unep. She previously served as a UNDP Regional Technical Advisor for Adaptation for the East and Southern African region, and for the UK Department for International Development at headquarters from 2003 to 2007 as their adaptation policy lead, as well as the UK representative in the EU delegation to the UNFCCC for 4 years. Jessica has more than 20 years of experience in environment and development policy, and she's been within climate change adaptation planning in the UN for the past 12 years. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much, Liz, for the introduction. My role really is just to provide a framework for the discussions in this session. And so with that, I will just provide a few words about UNEP, UNEP's mandate, and why NAPs are so important to it. So to the first slide, please. Thank you. So UNEP was established in 1972 to help the world deal with a deteriorating global environment. Unfortunately, the state of environment is in a crisis now. There are three interconnected crises: climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution. And these three crises are putting our economic and social well-being at risk while undermining opportunities to reduce poverty and improve lives and livelihoods, as demonstrated by the COVID-19 crisis. These crises are primarily linked to current unsustainable patterns of consumption and production, which were recognised in the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development that gave rise to the Rio Conventions. Today, we remain off track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, especially the environment-related ones that are central to achieve every single one of the SDGs. And so at the 5th Environment Assembly, UN Environment Assembly that was held last month, UNEP renewed its efforts to deal with these issues in a new medium-term strategy for 2022 to 2025, where we have placed the three environmental crises of climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution at the heart of our work. All of these are connected to vulnerability to climate change and adaptation. And this is where NAPs, National Adaptation Planning processes, can help countries in developing governance frameworks for adaptation and resilience, can help countries to move towards more resilient development pathways. Next slide, please. And so just a few key facts to help us frame why we're doing what we're doing. The Earth's mean surface temperature has already warmed by about 1 degree centigrade above pre-industrial levels. At the current rate of greenhouse gas emissions, we will likely reach a warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade in the early 2030s, 10 years from now. And with current pledges in the national determined contributions, the world is on a pathway to a 3 or even 4 degree centigrade temperature increase. And so this is obviously a very alarming pathway and completely unsustainable for us. Some impact information. In 2018, damages from climate-related disasters cost an estimated $155 billion US. Globally, 24% of land is degraded. More than 1.5 billion people directly depend on these lands, and 74% of them live in poverty. By 2050, it is projected that 143 million people in 3 regions of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, comprising 2.8% of the population of these regions, will have become internal migrants due to climate change. And 1 million of the world's estimated 8 million species of plants and animals, including insects, are threatened with extinction. All of these impacts are not, stuff of fiction. They are happening, and they are projected to happen due to analytical work that has been undertaken. So what now needs to happen is that country governments have to undertake analysis on what this means for their own economies and their own populations. Science must inform and drive financial, economic, and behavioural shifts. We need better science to do that. The stock of science in developing countries, and particularly in the poorest developing countries, is really very, very weak. Environmental governance, supported by enabling macroeconomic policies, are critical in providing the vehicles with which to shift to more resilient pathways. So NATs are indeed a really important mechanism for supporting governments on this process of developing environmental governance on adaptation. Thank you. Next slide, please. And so UNEP's work in adaptation, we can summarize it in 5 key points. The first is supporting member states to implement the provisions of the Paris Agreement with respect to adaptation. What that means is developing methods and tools to help adaptation planning and decision making, improving the science and policy interface in adaptation policies and planning, developing early warning systems and advisories, and piloting and upscaling ecosystem-based adaptation. The second point is accessing finance through multilateral and bilateral sources, as well as improving access to domestic resources for adaptation. The third is improving the scientific understanding of vulnerability and risk with respect to climate change. And in particular, given UNEP's mandate, the importance of ecological indicators in transmitting risk and in adapting to climate change. And the fourth point, excuse me, is building constituencies of support for adaptation, giving voice to different stakeholder groups, thereby promoting political action on adaptation and ultimately the uptake of adaptation strategies. Thank you. Next slide, please. And so for the last 10 years, UNEP has been supporting member states to access international climate change funds. We have about 50 plus ecosystem-based adaptation projects that we have supported member states with, totaling about $330 million worth of grant finance, restoring a total of 113,000 hectares of land and benefiting around 2.5 million people. Obviously, in relation to the world's needs and in relation to developing countries' needs, it's a small proportion, but our plans are to scale up via better advocacy, better influencing, and more programming. And so in our medium-term strategy cycle over the next 4 years, that is what we will concentrate on doing. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Hello? Yeah. Thank you. Sorry for the technical glitch. So here are just a few examples of the way that we are using ecosystems to support people's adaptive capacity. So we have a project in Seychelles, which is planting mangroves to protect coastal livelihoods from erosion and flooding. We have a project in Albania, which is restoring sand dunes to preserve a lagoon that's vital for fishing and tourism. We have a project in Cambodia that's supporting livelihoods in mountain ecosystems, and in the Gambia in supporting livelihoods in dryland systems. And we have a series of targets there. So this is just a small insight into the sorts of projects that we support member states to program. Next slide, please. We also use ecosystems to reduce the exposure to climate change impacts. So, for example, planting watersheds to support flow regulation of rivers. What that means is that we prevent floods in heavy rainfall events, but also support the mitigation of droughts by maintaining the annual flow of surface rivers, many of which have dried up at certain points in the calendar year. Obviously using mangrove forest to prevent coastal erosion and protect coastal environments from sea surges and damages, and obviously protecting soils through planting grasses and trees on slopes, which is really important to prevent sedimentation flows and downstream flooding impacts. Next slide, please. And so back to the NAPs, we're supporting 32 member states, developing countries on NAP processes. Currently, we have 18 projects under implementation, with another 13 or 14 that are being designed. That is the coverage of the ones that are under implementation. And a very strong focus in these NAPs is to identify climate change risks, making sure that we're supporting countries to understand what the medium to long-term climate change risk is, not just the risk now, but what is the risk in 5 to 10 years' time? What is the risk likely to be in 20 years' time? And what is the role of the environment, natural capital, in either magnifying the risks or in if we invest in natural capital in adaptation responses. Next slide, please. And so why is EBA important for NAP processes, and why are, what are the key constituents of NAP processes? One is to improve the scientific evidence base and the role of ecosystems within that. The second is to build capacity, systems and tools to undertake the NAP process at regular planning intervals. This should not just be a one-off planning exercise, it should be repeated in future. Why? Because the climate change risk is dynamic and changing, as well as underlying development drivers. The third is to broaden the range of key stakeholders in the NAP process, include stakeholders that are working on environment that can advise on what the environment, vulnerability, climate change links could be. And fourth, promoting mainstreaming of NAP priorities into development planning processes and policies. And that is really important because that is the way to operationalize and ultimately fund NAP priorities. And these four elements are essentially reflected in the objectives of the NAP process as enshrined in Decision 5 CP17 and in the 2012 NAP Technical Guidelines, which our friend and colleague Paul Dasanka led on within the LEG, the Least Developed Countries Expert Group of the UNFCCC. And so with that, I hope that that's provided a useful framework for discussions and deliberations in this session, and I wish everyone all the best in the next hour or so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that excellent overview. I'd like to welcome all of our participants and people in the audience today to kindly use our Q&A section to ask any questions that you have of any of our speakers or panelists, and we will do our best to be getting to them throughout the session. Thank you so much. I'd now like to invite Dr. Paul DeSanker to provide a short keynote speech. Paul is a manager with extensive experience in the adaptation division of the Secretariat of the UN's Climate Change Convention, and he oversees the work on support to the LDCs, to NAPs, and loss and damage under the Convention and Paris Agreement. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Very glad to be here, and I'm glad to see Jessica. We go back ways back when we're negotiating the LDC decisions in 2001, and those were exciting times, and I'm glad to be still associated with this process. The APAN forums are one of the key highlights of the year in terms of adaptation, networking, and so forth. So I'm very glad to be part of this event this year. Our director, Yusuf Nassif, sends his regards to everybody, and he would have liked to be here himself. I have about 5 minutes, so I will not use PowerPoint. I wanted to raise 5 key points. I'm glad about the flexibility in timing for this session, but please do alert me if I go over time. So I'll jump straight into it. First, NAP is the main modality for governments to address adaptation action under the Climate Change Convention and the Paris Agreement. And it does come with mandatory funding through the Green Climate Fund, as well as additional funding from the GEF for the preparation of the NAP itself, as well as for the implementation of the priorities identified therein. This process, as Jessica said, was established as way back as in 2010. Guidelines were negotiated in 2011, technical guidelines in 2012. GCF was asked to expedite funding for the formulation of NAPs in 2015. And they started to fund each country that was interested to a maximum amount of $3 million per country in 2016. And then where are we now? We're in 2020. So you can see the spacing of measures of progress along NAPs. And I think that perhaps it's time that we turn things around and actually ensure that we do make progress and once for all, and countries can get on with the problem of addressing climate change. Second, we have the vision that perhaps all developing countries should produce their first NAP this year, certainly in time for COP26. Why this year? Because this is the year that the whole UN system has actually highlighted the urgency to deal with the climate change emergency, not just through mitigation actions, but also in terms of adaptation and the increasing cost of disasters and so forth. So this is a key year to kind of make substantial progress towards achieving resilience in the long run. This year is also crucial in a number of other ways. This is the year when the $100 billion climate finance is supposed to kind of come into play, and the very good signs that we are going towards that. So there are significant amounts of resources available to support climate change action. Second, of course, is we know that a lot of countries are now updating their NDCs to increase their mitigation ambition. We're not there yet. I think a few significant countries still have to submit their NDCs this year, and we hope that by the end of the year, we'll have seen a significant rise in the ambition towards our less than 1.5 degree global warming in the long run. The NAPs are slow in coming, as I said earlier, but they are also quite important in helping countries inform the adaptation components of the adaptation communications, whether that's as submitted as a NAP or as a standalone adaptation communication or as part of the NDC. But we hope that the work that the countries are doing on NAPs is actually the basis for that climate adaptation ambition. Third, adaptation is a relatively young field, and it's often said to be complex. And part of the confusion perhaps is knowing just what one is talking about at a given time and place. Some of the characteristics of adaptation include what it is. Adaptation can be a process, it can be an outcome, It can be a transformation, etc. So adaptation is a number of different things. So the NAP itself is a national plan designed to communicate priorities for the country, embracing all the relevant systems, actors, places, etc. All well aligned, obviously, to national development plans and strategies. There are two key components. There's the process that supports that plan in terms of the research, systematic observation, the stakeholder consultations, and so forth. That's ideally should be a long-term process of doing those assessments and doing the engagement of our stakeholders, etc. And parallel to that is the process of producing the plan itself. And hopefully this should be done on a regular cycle, and most countries are opting to do it every 5 years. So there's the process, and then there's the plan itself that documents what at a given time and space, what those priorities are. And then these instruments are then used to access climate finance. Oftentimes these two are confused, and once you throw money at a problem, usually you get 100 different actors, and everybody starts to push things a certain way. But we hope that all countries now are quite focused in what they're doing, and they're setting up these long-term and permanent structures to support the adaptation planning, while also making progress to produce the plans. The funding is available for both for the process as well as for the implementation of the NAPs that come out of that. Related to this is the notion that that has been prevailing over the last few years, that adaptation is just local. But in fact, adaptation should happen at different levels and scales. This is perhaps one of the greatest departures in terms of our thinking in how we conceptualize what adaptation is. At the global level, obviously, the convention itself is part of the process of supporting adaptation in creating these processes and funding and technical support, etc. There are also very substantial early warning systems, data systems, and so on that are done at the global level to support action at the regional and the national level. The regional level, obviously, this is a lot of interest now in transboundary climate risk and how to deal with that. And then the national level is the place where within a country, the planning infrastructure, whether it's Ministry of Planning and Finance and Environment and so forth, all get together to create the necessary policy and governance systems to enable and facilitate adaptation action at all levels below that. And obviously, government is composed of sectoral ministries and then different subnational governments and down to the local level and so on. So we hope that the NAP embraces all of these levels and then captures what the country is able to do. So fourth is there are obviously some essential sectors and systems that each country should include, and these include the obvious ones: agriculture and food security, water resources, health, and naturally ecosystems and nature are a very key component of that infrastructure for the NAP, climate extremes and disasters and so forth. So countries should, I think, at a bare minimum address these 5 or 6 key sectors and issues. Fifth and last, I think as we have been doing this for the last 10 or so years, at least through the NAP itself and prior to that through other processes, we should start to focus on results, outcomes, and impact. I think we've done very well in terms of putting in place processes and all of these assessments and so forth, but it's time, I think, to start to focus on what are the outcomes and impact of the activities that we're implementing on the ground. So that's perhaps an important point of departure for this decade, I think, is to start to see where do we want to be 10 years from now when the SDGs are completed. Where do we want to see climate change in terms of national planning? How well is it integrated into our sort of budgets and development planning and so forth? And then how have we actually helped the most vulnerable in the countries to cope and build resilience? So I'll perhaps stop here as I see Liz. So these are some of the 5 points I wanted to make. So hopefully some of this will resonate with you, but I look very much forward to the discussion that's going to ensue and the work that FAO and UNEP and others are doing on promoting nature-based adaptation. They've been the experts at this, and we hope that they will provide the guidance that's needed in the countries to make very rapid progress in addressing these issues. So thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of the session.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul, for joining us, and thank you for that excellent overview of the process and where we're at now, and the drive this year and in the coming decade, which is so crucial. We really benefit from the experience and expertise of both yourself and Jessica, so we're very glad that you've been able to join us for the session today. I would like to direct all of our speakers and panelists to the Q&A box and thank our attendees for already asking some very interesting questions. Please do take a look at the box. I'd be very happy to see a discussion happening there, and please do feel free, Paul or Jessica or other panelists and speakers to respond to some of those questions. They're very good ones. And for all of our attendees, please do continue to keep asking. As promised, I'd like to jump over to our very first interactive session, part of this session, which is our Mentimeter. So I'd like to ask all of you to pull up on your screen your menti.com page. And if you haven't yet gone to the page, please feel free to go there now. You may also use your phone's camera to scan the QR code that you see on the screen. You can type in the code 21308972. And I'm going to be asking my colleague Anna if she could share her screen so we can see the results of the first 3 questions of the Menti, if we could see them live. So Anna, if you could pull up the Menti now. Thank you so much. And our first question, as you'll see on your screen, is which country are you joining us from? This is a word cloud. It's a free response form, so you may type in any country that you would like. And as we have more responses that are the same, you'll see that the word gets bigger automatically on our screen. So I see that we have Thailand right in the middle with quite a few people joining. Welcome. We've got the Philippines, Indonesia, and Japan. Quite a few from Germany, and I see some of my colleagues in the chat right now. China, Samoa, Netherlands. We've got South Korea, Bangladesh, Australia. Fantastic. I see we have at least 20 countries represented. Fantastic. Welcome, everybody. You may continue to respond to this question while we move to the next one. I'm moving my head sideways so I could read all the responses. The second question that we have to start off with is, which type of organization do you represent? And we'd love to know if you are from a national government or an international organization, academia, an NGO, private sector, or other. And if you respond other, I'd love to know what other organization you're from. So please do feel free to enter into the chat if you feel other best corresponds to your type of organization. We'd love to know where you're joining us from. I see that we have a good mixture of people in the audience, so welcome to everybody. Government, private, and non-autonomous. All right, a hybrid. Fantastic. If I can ask for the third question now, again, you may feel free to respond to the first 2, but we're going to be showing the third on the screen. And here the question is, it's different from where you're currently based or joining us from, but I'd love to know what country or more than one country you work in, especially as it relates to adaptation. And I see that we've got a lot of responses here. Fantastic. Something like 30 countries I see on the screen at least. Indonesia, quite a lot. Philippines and Thailand, Cambodia and India. Lao PDR, I see from all over Asia. This is fantastic. Vietnam, Pacific. I see someone working in Kenya. Excellent. Wonderful. Great. It's very gratifying to see such a range of different countries that people are working in. Some people working globally. Excellent. Again, if you feel that the responses we have on the Menti don't accurately reflect where you work or how you work, please feel free to join us in the chat and let us know what you're doing and where you're working. Thank you so much for that. Anna, I'm going to ask you if you can stop sharing your screen, and I will need to reshare mine. Hope you can all see my screen again now. We always have a little bit of a challenge when we toggle back and forth. All right, we are back to the presentation. And I'm now going to be handing over to our first sectoral specialist, which Miss Julie Greenwald, who's working at Go Green for Climate and one of the authors of the publication Building Resilience with Nature, Maximizing EBA through Nat Processors that just came out a few months ago. Julie is an expert on climate change, sustainable cities, and nature-based solutions. And she's worked on enhancing climate action in a wide range of countries across Asia, Africa, and Central and Latin America. In 2019, she started Go Green for Climate and has worked on projects ranging from the development of an adaptation finance facility in Indonesia to supporting community development and climate change adaptation work in Nigeria. She's previously worked for the Global Center on Adaptation, Cities Alliance, UN Habitat, Unep, and UNDP. Julie, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz. And thanks to all the organizers of this session. It's a pleasure to present on this work on behalf of the NAP Global Network, which is hosted by the International Institute for Sustainable Development. So as Liz mentioned, I worked on this analysis and this piece of work last year with my colleague Annie Churton from IISD. And essentially what this work was we undertook a review of existing NAP documents to better understand the extent to which countries incorporate EBA solutions into their national planning for adaptation. And then we took that information to provide recommendations for how countries in their NAP process could do this. And we felt this was quite important given that 125 countries are currently undertaking the NAP process. And it offers an important opportunity to use them to upscale EBA and bridge biodiversity and adaptation goals, which some of the other presenters have talked about. Next slide. Very good. So the review examined the 19 NAPs that have been submitted to national governments, by national governments to the UNFCCC from 2014 to March 2020. The full document, the full analysis is available on the NAP Global Network website, but I would like to just quickly highlight a few of the high-level observations that we made. So in the review of the NAP, it clearly showed that the vulnerability of people and ecosystems is a serious concern. So many countries are striving for adaptation actions that will protect both in a changing climate, and we thought that was very encouraging. And all countries that we reviewed, all the NAPs that we reviewed, made efforts to integrate ecosystems and identified ecosystem services in their submitted NAPs. Most countries did include EBA actions to reduce the threats to and vulnerabilities of ecosystems and people they identified in the NAP. However, it wasn't always explicitly clear how individual measures described might be linked to climate-related hazards and risks and deliver measurable adaptation outcomes that went beyond business as usual. So for example, several of the NAPs talked about sustainable forest management initiatives, and they explained the importance of natural resource management and the benefits there, but they didn't necessarily explain exactly how that was building resilience or what risks that was reducing. So there was a little bit of a gap there. Forest, freshwater, and coastal ecosystems were definitely the most commonly identified as vulnerable. And both marine and coastal ecosystems, along with forestry, were often highlighted as standalone sectors or as specific subsectors within a larger ecosystem sector. So certainly there was an emphasis on those particular types of ecosystems, whereas mountains and highlands, grasslands and deserts or arid regions were mentioned more when talking about a country's vulnerability context, but much fewer references were made to specific adaptation actions in those ecosystems or sort of working with those ecosystems. There is evidence, certainly, that countries are starting to link the NAP process and ecosystems to other relevant national strategies and global agendas. Unfortunately, a lot of these were done before the SDGs, so there were some connections to SDGs, but more we saw a lot in, especially Latin America, the linkages between the NAP and the National Biodiversity Strategy. This wasn't quite as prevalent in the other regions, but there is, I think, a concerted effort to show how the NAP process and outcomes with ecosystems and biodiversity through national adaptation planning is also related to coherence of other international agreements and national goals. Next slide. So the next slide, I'm just going to go briefly into one that we thought was a really good example of incorporating EBA. And so this is Fiji. So in 2016, Cyclone Winston was the biggest storm ever recorded in the Southern Hemisphere, and it wiped out a third of Fiji's GDP in a matter of hours. And, unfortunately, recognizing this pressing need, the government began developing its NAP in 2017. The NAP includes a series of priority investment areas and 160 specific measures to build climate resilience. The use of ecosystem-based adaptation, such as mangroves for coastal protection or watershed restoration for flood management, appear several times in the plan, providing a strong mandate for their use at scale. Similarly, Fiji has undertaken some economic valuations of nature for sectors such as tourism and water. And we also were quite impressed with the monitoring and evaluation of the measures. So they had very strong measurement of the impacts expected from the EBA measures and adaptation measures in general. Momentum around such solution has grown since the NAP was launched, and this vetiver grass is an important form of EBA there. And in 2020, the Prime Minister unveiled a new vetiver grass nursery, and the vetiver grass is being used as part of a nature-based seawall that the government is constructing. So this, I think, shows a really nice path from, unfortunately, a very terrible event, how this spurred action, how EBA has really been well integrated into not only the NAP, but how this has helped to launch more EBA work on the ground in Fiji. Next slide. So following the analysis of the existing NAPs, we wanted to highlight several key areas where we thought that countries may benefit from strengthening their approach to ecosystems and EBA solutions via the NAP process. So these are just a few of the recommendations that we had in the guidance note. So in order to accelerate scaling off of ecosystem-based approaches, we felt that NAPs should really highlight that all of our economies and communities are underpinned by healthy and functioning ecosystems, in particular by prioritizing EBA solutions across sectors as part of an overall strategy to help people adapt to climate change, in particular non-conservation sectors. So really getting EBA out of just kind of talking about forestry or marine and coastal, but looking at why ecosystems are so important for economic and social resilience. We also really felt that there's a need to further effort the strengthening of monitoring and evaluation of outcomes related to EBA solutions. One, to continue building the evidence base, but also, as Paul, I think, mentioned in his presentation, really to see where the progress is being made and to look back 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and understand where countries have improved on their EBA initiatives. But what we felt was really something that's most important and we really wanted to emphasize was that in order to really ensure that EBA solutions are designed to help people and delivering on this results, they really must address an identified current or future climate hazard. So really linking the solutions to a hazard and risk, really generate adaptation benefits for vulnerable groups. Again, making that linkage to who exactly is benefiting from the EBA actions clear. That it also works to build the resilience of ecosystems. So as we said, all countries in the ones we had reviewed really emphasized the vulnerability of ecosystems and the way that they're already being degraded and what the impacts from climate change. So the need to build resilience of ecosystems is clear for countries. And then also making sustainable use of biodiversity. And with this recommendation and actually throughout the guidance note, that we developed, we actually link to some resources that we find are useful. So, whether it's effectiveness criteria or whether it's other monitoring or financing resources that have been developed. We also link to some of the gender resources. So the guidance note highlights what these recommendations are, but we also provide linkages to resources that we think will help countries in their process in the NAP. So just to close out, the guidance note and the analysis, as well as the short video, are all available online on the NAP Global Network website, and look forward to the discussion, any questions you might have about the analysis or the recommendations that we put forward. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that excellent overview. And I'd also like to ask, just as with Paul and Jessica, I see that both are very actively answering questions in the Q&A section. So I thank you both for that. Also for Julie, her presentation, please do feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. And I welcome all of our panelists and speakers to take a look there and keep the discussion going. And we will also open up after these three presentations for a bit of a round of questions with you together. I am now going to be jumping over to our next presentation, the second sectoral presentation, which is in the area of forestry and agroforestry and NAPs. I would like to welcome Mr. Alexandre Maybeck, who is the Senior Technical Advisor in the Forest, Trees and Agroforestry Research Program at CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research. Alexandre has been a Senior Advisor on Agriculture, Environment and Climate Change at the FAO, where he created and coordinated the FAO Unep Sustainable Food Systems Program. He has worked extensively on issues related to sustainability, food security, and nutrition at both national and international levels, and has also served in the French Ministry of Agriculture. He'll be presenting today some key points from Supplementary Guidelines that he co-authored on Addressing Forestry and Agroforestry in NAPs. Alexandre, pleasure to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm particularly pleased to be here because, as you know, the headquarters of CIFOR are in Bogor, Indonesia. So what I'm going to present very briefly is a joint publication of FAO and the Forestries and Agroforestry Research Program of the CGIAR. This has been constructed using science and also the NAPs that were already published at the time, and the experience of the FAO UNDP program on how to better integrate the agricultural sectors, including forestry, in the NAP process. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this publication is to show the roles and importance of forest and trees for adaptation, not only for their own adaptation, but also how they can contribute to other sectors' adaptation and overall to the adaptation of the whole economy and the whole country. It is addressed to NAP practitioners and also to the forestry and agricultural actors to help them engage and contribute to the process. Because what we see and what's happening is that you need at the same time to build a strong process inside the sector, raising awareness, understanding the vulnerabilities, and we have a specific publication about that, and how to address them, and properly organize links with other sectors at both national and local levels. The purpose is really to create a forward-looking intersectoral policy dialogue on how the various sectors can interlink for adaptation. Next slide, please. So this is a very schematic representation of the links between sectors, and of course, forestry and agroforestry are in the center here. The idea, the arrows are both representing contributions, biophysical or economic, to the adaptation of other sectors, and the links that can be institutional links that need to be created as part of the NAP process in order to strengthen these contributions. Of course, a lot of the contribution of forest and trees to adaptation will be achieved at local level in the landscape as part of ecosystem-based adaptation, but they also need to be implemented an enabling environment that generally needs to be created at national level. Another point on which I want to insist on that slide is that our publication also stresses the importance to consider co-benefits between adaptation and mitigation, but also co-benefits with other sustainable development goals, because they are particularly important in the sector, but also because they are often drivers of action, and especially of long-term action. And from our experience, this is also one of the things that, next slide, please, that's very important, is that foresters by definition have a long-term perspective. And it really helps having this long-term dialogue. So here are a few examples of adaptation actions already figuring in some NAPs, in NDCs, and on the ground, covering all types of forest, from natural forest to agroforestry and tree commodity plantations. One is monitoring impacts of climate change on biodiversity, associating local communities. This is an action in the NAP of Sri Lanka. Forest fire watch and prevention in the NAPs of Fiji and Sri Lanka. I took my examples in the region. Mangroves and coastal forest protection, as has been already mentioned in several countries. Next slide, please. Agroforestry is mentioned in numerous NAPs and NDCs, in Kiribati, and it has been properly structured in the region by the agroforestry policy of India, of Nepal, and the Asian guidelines for agroforestry development. A very good example of how a sector can be properly integrated in a NAP are tree commodities in the Sri Lanka NAP. And here it's very clear that the association, since the beginning of the technical institute, the scientists and the sectors, to the preparation of the NAP, has helped prepare a global package for adaptation, germplasm, research on germplasm, management of the plantation, pest monitoring, research, capacity development. So for the adaptation of the commodities, but also to strengthen the contribution of these plantations to adaptation, both by using the reduction of heat effect of these plantations and strengthening social and economic resilience of smallholders. So it's a nice example. Next slide, please. Yeah, and you will find more material and knowledge and examples from the various programs that FAO has conducted on the links that are indicated there, and of course the publication itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Alexandra. And let me also remind people to please do add any questions for Alexandra and our other speakers directly into the Q&A box. I see that it's very lively, and the messages are coming up my screen. So I'm very happy that the conversation is continuing there. Finally, I'm going to move to our third sectoral presentation, which will be given by Ms. Christina Romanelli, who's at the WHO's Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health. Christina is an environmental scientist with almost 20 years of postgraduate experience in interdisciplinary research, policy evaluation and development, multi-stakeholder engagement, capacity building, and high-level scientific and policy advice in both research and regulatory compliance settings. Her work focuses on strengthening the science policy interface at the nexus of global environmental change, notably including biodiversity loss and climate, and human health, with a focus on sustainable and healthy food systems, nature-based solutions, and integrated approaches to health for a healthy and green recovery from COVID-19. Christina, so happy you're here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Liz. It is such a pleasure to participate in this crucial dialogue of the 7th Asia Pacific Forum with you all today. And, again, many thanks to Unep for the invitation to WHO to ensure that the health sector really has a voice in this cross-sectoral dialogue and in the development of ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation moving forward. And for giving me a platform also to highlight some of the opportunities for the integration of health and biodiversity linkages in the NAP that the NAP development process can provide. The first of which, as the first slide will show, really centers around evidence-based, evidence-based decision making. So as you can see in this slide, at WHO, like many of the organizations represented here today, of course, we've long been fully committed to drawing and building on the full range of scientific evidence from various fields to inform policymakers in an effort to build health as well as social and ecological resilience. And ecosystem-based adaptation really does provide an opportunity to do just that, to strengthen that evidence-based decision-making and our vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. So as you see in the smaller picture on the left-hand side, the State of Knowledge Review on Biodiversity and Health really is an example of how WHO sought to bring evidence of the crucial interconnections and to make palatable, if you will, to policymakers working in different sectors, to make these linkages palatable to them, and so as to better embed health and biodiversity consideration in the development of sectoral strategies, policies, plans, and actions, so as to address our most pressing health, development, climate, and biodiversity challenges in a much more integrated way. The figure that you see on the right-hand side with the 3 circles shows how intimately interconnected human health outcomes are with biodiversity and the delivery of ecosystem services, some of which were addressed by speakers earlier today. Whether it be access to fresh water, healthy and nutritious foods, clean air, access to medicine, and how closely these connect with the drivers of climate change and the full range of social, political, and economic factors. So as you see here, health really is at the center of and an intersection of these 3 drivers. And the arrows that you see are not causal necessarily, but an expression of the dynamics that are inherent within these drivers. So what this seeks to exemplify really is that or highlight is that many of the same drivers that lead to biodiversity loss, whether that be land use changes such as deforestation, the overexploitation of marine and freshwater resources, the destruction of coral reef habitats, not only pose direct and indirect threats to human health by hindering the delivery of ecosystem services, but also by hindering their processes and functioning, as well as their capacity to regulate pests and disease, climate, droughts, floods, heat stress, and other extreme weather events. And how these are mediated by a range of social and political drivers that can in turn magnify biological change and sometimes really exacerbate that negative human health outcomes. So essentially what this really shows is that as we continue to place pressure on our ecosystems and on our human and social systems, including our health systems, these combined drivers also exacerbate climate change, further weakening our social and ecological resilience to climate change. And I'm going to emphasize that over and over today. And importantly, it's also relevant to consider that these impacts will inevitably be hardest felt amongst the most vulnerable communities, which not only often coincide with biodiversity hotspots, they are, they're also often focused or in areas in which access to health systems and social protection mechanisms are often weaker. Moving much faster through the next slides, Liz, sorry about that. So as the next slide emphasizes, against this backdrop of complex interconnections, it really becomes essential to meaningfully embed health consideration through the various policy development processes. And I'll focus my attention to the one most germane to the discussion being held here today. So National Adaptation Plans. So to assist countries with the integration of health in NAPs, WHO recently published new guidance or quality criteria for Health National Adaptation Plans, or HNAPs, which I'll get to in a moment. But what's important on this slide is to consider some of the essential reasons and rationale for really embedding health consideration in these planning processes. These reasons span from, as you see here, prioritizing the health impacts of climate change planning at all levels and across all spheres of governance, raising the profile of the health sector in the global climate agenda, which is often underrepresented, to ensuring greater coordination and integration across the full range of health determining factors, and importantly, also building climate resilient health systems that are in turn able to anticipate and adapt in the face of global environmental changes. So the document that you'll see, therefore, on the next slide, therefore supplements earlier WHO guidance to health NAP development, which include WHO guidance to protect health from climate change through health adaptation planning, and an operational framework for building climate resilient health systems. And it's also consistent with the technical guidelines that were developed by the LEG. So the aim of the quality criteria document that you see here is not necessarily to show how to develop an HNAP, because this is already covered by the other guidance I just mentioned. But it aims to address some of the questions and challenges that have been faced by countries so far in developing their HNAPs, and to provide guidance on aspects of what essentially is a good quality NAP, if you will. So in fact, the aims of this criteria, which, credit where credit is due, has really been spearheaded by my colleagues Amy Savage and Elena Villalobos, also from the Climate and Change and Health team at WHO, really did aim to provide brief and practical additional guidance to address some of the challenges experienced by countries in developing health NAPs. And they really incorporate a number of ways forward and lessons learned in the development of the criteria, and include a few case studies throughout the document across each of the 6 building blocks that you see listed here. It should maybe be noted that nature-based solutions were not key area of focus in the new quality criteria for Health National Adaptation Plans, is that is in part, going to be analyzed in a subsequent document that's going to be released at the end of September, that will explicitly focus on integrating health considerations and nature-based solutions to climate adaptation and mitigation. So maybe to save time, as I realize I only have 5 minutes, I might have to move directly on to my concluding slide, in which I really want to bring us back to how essential explicitly mainstreaming health consideration in the development and implementation of ecosystem-based approaches to climate adaptation and mitigation is across the different spheres of interconnection that were addressed in the opening slide, and to emphasize the opportunities for the co-design and implementation of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation across the various societal challenges that are exemplified to the small image that you see to the left. So leaving you with the message that they're not only an opportunity to coordinate and align national policies with global commitments, that all, with the firm belief that all sectors really need to work together to achieve, whether this be the Paris Agreement, the post-2020 biodiversity agenda, or the sustainable development goals. But equally important, this provides an essential opportunity to build back better through greener, healthier, and more just policies in the context of a post-COVID-19 recovery, several recommendations of which are encapsulated in the document that you see to your right. So to conclude, what we know about the development of NAPs so far is that while the vulnerability of natural environments and ecosystems to climate change and to the impacts on ecosystem services is generally well covered, the explicit direct or indirect contributions to health and broader societal benefits for people are often implied, assumed, or really discussed in very generic terms rather than systematically assessed. We also know that hybrid options that bring together green and gray infrastructure are generally underrepresented in these NAPs, that monitoring of health outcomes and impacts of ecosystem-based approaches is often weak, and the identification of targeted financial resources and partnerships that jointly target EBA, EBM, ecosystems, and health are vastly underrepresented. So where there are weaknesses, there are also tremendous opportunities. And I really look forward to hearing some of the country examples that are going to be presented next. Leaving it here for now. Thank you so much.
Christina, thank you so much. I think you win a prize for most inopportune time to be joining this session. I think it's something like 3 in the morning for you there. Thank you so much for joining us. What a rich contribution from Christina, from Alexandra, and Julie. There is so much material that we've been hearing, and I myself am learning a lot. I'd really like to thank all of you for those in-depth presentations looking at NAPs from different sectors. I'm very cognizant of the time. We are running over a bit longer than we had expected or had hoped for. And although I would love to listen to this discussion for much longer, we do have to move along. For that reason, what I'm going to do now is ask that we move the Q&A session that we have foreseen in the program into the Q&A box. So there have been a lot of questions coming in, fantastic questions. I'd like to ask for each of our speakers so far, please go into the Q&A box, also take a look at the chat, and see if there are questions that you feel you'd like to respond to. Please also feel free to respond to other people's responses and ask each other as panelists and speakers, challenge each other to look for those interactions between your presentations and sectors, or to question some of the things that you might have heard. So I really welcome you. Please go to the Q&A section now, and please do ask any questions that you would like of the panelists, and I look forward to seeing the discussion there. I'd also like to ask everyone who's joining our session, and I see that the numbers have gone up to around 150, so welcome to everyone who's joined us. We are going to go to a few more questions in the Menti while we are also asking questions in the Q&A and chat boxes. So for those of you, I hope, who've already started the Menti, I hope you still have that browser open with your Menti questionnaire, so please go back there now. And for those who have joined in the meantime, please feel free to use your phone's camera to scan the QR code that you see here on the screen, or go to www.menti.com and enter the code you see here on your screen, 21308972. And I'm going to be asking my colleague Anna once again to share her screen so that we can see the responses in the Menti. Great. So the next question that we have, in the countries that you are working, so previously you will have responded to let us know where, in which country or countries you're primarily working in. We'd like to know, in those countries that you work in, at what stage is the Nat process in the country that you work in? And here you have several answers to choose from. That it's not yet started, that you're in the first stage, which is planning and development, that you're in the second stage of implementation, the third stage of monitoring and review, or that you've already completed a NAP. Many of you may also be responding, which I can see that you're not sure about the NAP process currently in your country. We heard earlier in the session that there are approximately 125 NAPs that are currently underway in countries. And so it's no surprise to see that most countries might be in this planning and development stage for their NAP. We hope that the presentations that we're providing now, and especially the guidelines that you're going to see at the end of this session, one key message that we have is that no matter what stage you are in your NAP process, it is an iterative process. And so EBA principles can and should be brought in at any stage, or increased at any stage of the NAP process. So we do welcome you to think about this, whatever stage you are at in your own country or in countries you might be supporting. Let's move to the next question, Anna. Excellent. So the next question you should now see or be able to answer on your screen is, if there is a NAP in the country that you're working in, to what extent is EBA already being considered? And here you have three options to choose from. First, that you are not yet considering EBA. Secondly, that you are interested in including EBA in the process. And third, that you are already including EBA in your NAP process. And this is fantastic to see that the highest number of responses is actually coming in from people saying that they are already including EBA in their processes. So that's fantastic that countries are already looking at this. Almost half of our respondents. Excellent. We don't have a lot of people responding on this question, so I welcome you all to please enter your response now. It's a self-paced Menti questionnaire, so you can go back and respond to this also later on. It may be that you are not working on a NAP, or you're not sure about this question, about the response to this question. And if that's the case, you may also put your response in the chat to let us know. Great. While you're responding to that, I think we've got one more question, Anna. Excellent. And this last question is, in your experience, what are the key challenges of implementing EBA? And here you also have a few responses to respond to. It's very small on my screen, so you're going to see me squinting and staring at it. One of the challenges is limited access to finance to apply and scale up EBA. Another challenge could be lack of awareness and limited availability of knowledge of the benefits of ecosystems and their services. A third option for a challenge could be policy and regulatory environments and governance challenges that are not conducive to EBA. And then we have a fourth response, which is other. And again, here, if you choose other, we would love to hear from you in the chat about what you think that other challenge might be. Anna, we're going to see if we have one more question, or it's at the end of the Menti at this point. Great. This is a very important question, and I can see an incredibly rich array of responses. In your view, how can we increase the uptake of EBA? And I'm loving all of the responses that we're seeing here. I think this could take quite a bit of time just to go through this. Number one, what we're seeing right in the middle of the screen is capacity building, funding and finance, and policy. All of these things would be needed, but I see that we have a wide and rich array of other responses as well. I'd love to ask all of you who are joining in the session to enter these comments and questions within the Q&A section. Please pose questions to us about how we can increase the uptake of EBA. Let's get that discussion started in the chat, in the Q&A box. I welcome you to be provocative, push us a bit, and let us know how you think we can increase the uptake of EBA, what your own experiences have been. Thank you so much for this. Let's go to the next, Anna. Excellent. That is the end of the Menti, and I'd like to thank everybody for their responses and their active participation in that. We are now going to get to really the heart, for me, one of the most important parts of our session. And for that, it's my pleasure to welcome 3 representatives from 3 different countries who are looking at EBA in their Nat processes in different ways. We'll be hearing from Ms. Srijana Shrestha, the Undersecretary at the Ministry of Forest and Environment with the Government of Nepal. Srijana has been working in the Ministry of Forest and Environment since 2010. Her primary responsibilities are to lead the adaptation section of Climate Change Management Division of the ministry and coordinate the building capacity to advance national adaptation planning process and adapting to climate-induced threats to food production and food security in Nepal. Srijana is also the focal officer from the ministry, Nepal, for the Global Center on Adaptation in South Asia. Secondly, we'll have Ms. Jennifer DeBrum, Ridge to Reef Project Coordinator at UNDP in the Marshall Islands. The Ridge to Reef project emphasizes the interconnections between the natural and social systems from the mountain ridges of volcanic islands through coastal watersheds and habitats, and across lagoons to the fringing reef environments. Prior to joining UNDP, Jennifer worked at the Office of the Chief Secretary as a Joint National Action Plan Coordinator and at the Office of Environmental Planning and Policy Coordination as the Chief of Administration and Finance. Her educational background is in business administration, business economics, and general management. And we'll also be hearing from Ms. Champanut Songkao, who is the environmental official at the Climate Change Management and Coordination Division at the Office of Natural Resources and Environmental Policy and Planning within the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment in Thailand. Champanut is one of the team members working to formulate and implement Thailand's National Adaptation Plan. She has been working on climate change adaptation for more than 5 years and has obtained her master's degree in environmental science. We're so glad that all 3 of you can join us today. And I'm going to get us started by asking each of you to provide just a very quick background on the context of EBA and NAPs in your countries. And I'll lead with a few questions. First, over to you, Ms. Srijana. If you could tell us just a little bit about how EBA has been integrated into the NAP process in Nepal. And from your perspective, if you have feedback on the sectoral presentations that you've just seen, any responses to that? Over to you, Srijana.
Okay, thank you, Liz, and namaste to all. First of all, I would like to say that aligning with the LDC expert group Lake Technical Guidelines, Nepal NAP process is being formulated through the multi-stakeholder approach, engaging the stakeholder from all level of government, that is federal, provincial, and local, and both the horizontal and vertical coordination mechanism had put in place. Importantly, that NAP process acknowledge the EBA approach, having promoting nature-based solution and building synergy and ecosystem-based and community-based adaptation as one among the guiding principle of NAP formation in Nepal. Then Ministry of Forest and Environment is leading both the EBA project and the NAP process. And this is an opportunity to directly support and engage in the NAP process. And EBA best practices could easily be shared and integrated into the NAP process as this is being done in Nepal. While identifying the medium and long-term adaptation need for the country, for 2030 and 2050, the EVA that encompasses ecosystem services are considered as important holistic approach for the sector that are identified in the National Climate Change Policy 2019, where climate change adaptation intervention are deemed necessary and majority could be benefited through the EVA approach while addressing the climate change. This also provides an opportunity to really strategize the EVA integration in the NAP process. The EVA strategies are expected to form a basis for medium and long-term intervention in Nepal through NAP. Additionally, our priority plans and second national determined contribution document has also provided an opportunity to further EVA as a part of an adaptation intervention in Nepal. And this document has prioritized ecosystem-based adaptation intervention in sectors in Nepal. EVA, rather than focusing on a single adaptation intervention to specific hazard, put forward the idea of holistically addressing the climate change impact in the community, adhering the principle of ecosystem first principle. EVA activities and practices that going on here will serve as a basis and give a glimpse how people can adapt to the climate change impact. And this will also to build resilience of all that depends on ecosystem services through conservation, management, and utilization of natural resources like forest, biodiversity, water resources, and mountain through green job creation, fostering the agriculture and promoting the nature-based tourism. Now I stop here.
Thank you so much for that, Sridhana, and we hope to be able to come back to you also in the Q&A section, where hopefully you can elaborate also a bit more on the connections between your experience in Nepal and also the different sectors that we've been hearing from, as well as some of the challenges that have been addressed by participants of the Menti poll. Thank you so much for that overview. We're now going to move over to Ms. Jennifer de Brum, Ridge to Reef Coordinator in the Marshall Islands. Jennifer, we'd like to ask if you can tell us a bit about your experiences in implementing EBA into the NAP in Marshall Islands, and if you also have feedback on the sectoral presentations that you've heard. Over to you. Jennifer, we can't hear you if you're speaking. Your microphone might be muted.
Okay. I've just unmuted it, so I'm sorry about that. So with reference to your question, since 2011, the Marshall Islands has the National Conservation Plan called the Raymanla, and it's been implemented through a Raymanla process, and it is the National Community-Based Resource Management Planning process, the Raymanla process. And EBA is actually built into the Raymanla process, for example, through the design and enforcement of protected area networks for both marine and terrestrial, with specific rules, for example, closure or seize restrictions and pertaining to marine protections and terrestrial. And it is a very tailored management plan and for the local and local ordinances tailored for the specific communities that we are working in, which is basically 32 atolls in the entire Marshall Islands. The process uses a combination of traditional knowledge practices and robust science-based practices as well, complementing each other to produce very specific, site-specific information. It initially focuses on the marine realm, the Raymond-Luck process has moved towards the ridge to reef approach, therefore linking the nexus between land and ocean. So rather than just marine based ecosystems, we are looking at our terrestrial areas as well. So the Raymond-Luck process has already been implemented in half a dozen of the atolls in the Marshall Islands. So through this process, the Raymond-Luck is included in the NAP development process and the nationally determined contributions planning and processes and implementations in the country. So in terms of the NAP, then for the Marshall Islands, this plan is still currently in the early stages of development. So, there's always an opportunity now to integrate EBA approaches into the Raymond-Luck and through the Ridge to Reef into the National Adaptation Plans, dialogues, discussions, all of that process. In terms of our the feedbacks on the sectorial presentations and the value of the guidelines, the context of the Marshall Islands, I guess I would have to say they're very informative, very useful in informing the state of specific situations and circumstances in the Marshall Islands. It allows us to custom tailor our NAP according to the reality and the actual needs in the Marshall Islands. And I believe the guidelines are extremely valuable to guide the NAP process to avoid things like maladaptation practices, which would reduce our chances of survivability and building our resilience and in the face of climate change and sea level rise. So that is my feedback to that question. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We do have some targeted questions for both Jennifer and Srijana, and also for Champanud coming up within the Q&A box. So I do welcome you to take a look there, and please do join in that discussion with your responses, and I'll have a question or two for you at the end of these presentations. And just to let you know that we are coming up on our official 90 minutes of time, but we've kindly and generously been granted an extra 5 or 10 minutes so that we don't have to rush our speakers too much. I'd like to now ask, it's my pleasure to ask Champanud Somkau of the Office of Natural Resources and Environment Policy and Planning in Thailand to give also a brief overview of how EBA and nature-based approaches have been integrated into NAP processes in Thailand, and which sectors you found to be most valuable in this process. And again, if you have any thoughts or feedback on the sectoral presentations that we've heard or the responses to the Menti, I welcome you also to touch upon that. So Champanud, over to you.
Thank you so much. For Thailand, we have developed the National Adaptation Plan that approved by the National Committee on Climate Change Policy on November 2018 with the aim to provide a framework for climate change adaptation actions of the country in order to build resilience, reduce vulnerabilities, and increase adaptive capacity in agreement with the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. The plan emphasized the end result of the long-term prioritization in the 6 key sectors, which are water management, agriculture and food security, tourism, public health, natural resources management, and also human settlement and security. By adhering to the approach which are integrating climate change adaptation issue into the national policy and plan at all levels, approving adaptation options for each sector and for the cost-cutting issue in line with the national context, and also enabling related agencies to use the plan and as the framework for appropriately mainstreaming climate change adaptation issue into policies, plans, and projects. with the ability to coordinate effectively among concerned stakeholders in each sector to operational climate change action across different area-based levels, also such as the ecosystem, watershed, region, province, and city and community. Thailand, we developed the NAP with the consideration of the national context and circumstance by using the guiding principles such as national and local wisdom, sustainable development, and eco-based adaptation, or nature-based solution, and also community-based adaptation. That's just for example about the guiding principle for the NAP. And the NAP developed the EBA measure in the key sectors such as the natural resources management. We developed the measures such as develop the rule of ecological friendly communities by using the EBA and reduce the deforestation for monoculture and promote the cultivation of plant and animal that support for the forest system. And another measure is build knowledge and understanding on the climate change impact and enhance adaptive capacity of our stakeholders to the EBA in natural resources management and sustainable use for biodiversity and ecosystem service approach. And another sector is water resources management. We have some measures such as developing guidelines for implementing the EBA for watershed management. And the last sector is the human settlement and security. For the measures such as develop more the multifunctional green space and connecting both within the city and nearby to reduce the effect of flash floods and heat island, and also increase the flow of the wind, health benefit, and the area of evacuation and shelter. And from my experience, I have an opportunity to participate in the projects from the German and the Australia. They provide the training for and workshop for the government agency, and I think that is an opportunity to the developing countries to understand the EBA and NBS, and we have some opportunity for the sectoral to integrate the EBA into their plan. And that's all from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Champana, to Jennifer, and to Srijana for those very rich country experiences. I would like to ask each of you what I'd really love to know, and this is something that I'd love to see if we can have a conversation going in the Q&A and the chat boxes. But I'd love to know in each of your experiences, if you could just share with us in the chat and the Q&A, what do you think has been the single most factor which has helped you increase and implement EBA principles into adaptation planning in your country? I'd love to know your thoughts and experience on that. And I'd also love to know if you could share with us experience on what you think one of the biggest hindrance is. So what has been the biggest challenge for you as you implement and integrate EBA into your country? So please, I welcome you to take a look, go into the Q&A section, respond to specific questions that could be there. And also feel free to kindly share your experiences with us, because we'd really love to know about what your experiences have been specifically in your country, with the aim to sharing that with others who are looking at EBA principles. We had foreseen having a final mentee break here, but we have gone through all of the mentee questions already in the session. However, if you haven't yet gone on to Mentee and haven't yet answered the questions completely, I welcome you to still go there now. It is still open for you to answer questions. And we'd like to move on to our very last presentation in the session today, which last but certainly not least, because what we've been working on in the context of the NAP GSP project under the GEF is a set of supplementary guidelines on how countries can mainstream EBA into their NAP planning processes. And it's sessions like this and rich discussions that we are having with all of you today that have really been helping us understand what will help countries to further integrate and increase EBA into their NAP planning. And so this has been, I'm sure, a very rich discussion for our colleague Alejandro, who is leading on these guidelines for us at Unep and working very closely with our colleagues at IUCN. There is a dedicated Friends of EBA, FIBA working group that is supporting these guidelines. And I'm sure that many of you in the session today and listening in are part of that process. I welcome and thank all of you who have supported us so far. I'm going to hand over to Alejandro for just a few minutes of an update on these guidelines, what they contain, what they're intending to do, and how they're going to be finished and finalized and used over the coming months. So Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Liz. And I'm very glad to be here participating in this forum and overall in this process. Let's move to the next slide, please. So the EBA guidelines, the ultimate aim of these supplementary guidelines is to guide and motivate countries to adopt ecosystem approaches when planning for climate resilient development and when selecting and implementing adaptation options. This is to ensure that EBA is not only one of several measures in the NAP document, but also is mainstreamed into national and subnational adaptation and development planning. We realize that NAPs are the perfect planning instruments where the synergies between the 2030 agenda for the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai framework may be triggered and sustained by nature-based solutions and ecosystem approaches to climate change adaptation. We think this because NAPs help to coordinate cross-sectoral linkages and also to provide essential inputs to national climate strategies, NDCs, and mobilization of finance for implementation. EBA in the NAPs then becomes a benefit multiplier, a uniting force, and an optimal approach for optimizing resources. Next slide, please. So the role of ecosystems and ecosystem services in adaptation and mitigation is the leitmotif or the main theme running through the guidelines. Biodiversity for adaptation is also adaptation for biodiversity because the integrity of biological diversity is at the root of a world where the SDGs, climate adaptation, and disaster risk reduction may be achieved. Optimizing opportunities for biodiversity to thrive enhances resilience of a nature-dependent society to cope and adapt to climate change. Progressively adopting ecosystem approaches in policies dealing with water resources management, coastal zone management, land use planning, and others will also pave the way for better integrating EBA in the NAP process. The guidelines, in this case, we provide examples of all these sections that you see on the left of the slide: river and wetland restoration, connectivity across borders, and from countries such as Fiji, Rwanda, Tanzania, Colombia, Nepal, and transboundary landscapes and conflicted affected states, ecological corridors to increase connectivity at all scales in urban settings, in transboundary landscapes, but also in marine and freshwater ecosystems that need to be connected as well. Next slide, please. So what is in the guidelines? These guidelines are structured in 6 chapters. And we have over 135 references with links to most sources and publications. The first 2 chapters set the rationale and the groundwork. We shed light on nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, green infrastructure, ecosystem services for cross-sectoral adaptation to climate change, and NAPs. We move into chapter 2 for developing a plan for aligning, overcoming the barriers, for integrating EBA and mainstreaming EBA as part of the groundwork to set the base and facilitate an enabling environment for EBA. Then we move into chapter 3, 4, and 5, which are actually the heart of the guidelines themselves. Here we deal with the formulation stage of the guidelines. Of the NAP process, I'm sorry. We deal about implementation stage and also about the review stages of the NAP process, with also examples and case studies of decision support tools. We also address capacity building and issues of accessing domestic and international finance for EBA. In each one of the chapters, we describe entry points for EBA, opportunities and challenges of integrating EBA, the information gaps and capacity building needs, examples and case studies and tools. And then in chapter 6, we close the guidelines on recommendations and for decision makers, highlight the key messages and tips for national teams working on the NAP process, and how to face some of the main challenges when integrating EBA in adaptation and development planning at national, subnational, and sectoral levels. Next slide, please. Some of the, I would say, key messages coming out of the guidelines is that the climate and ecosystem lens enables planners to identify entry points for EBA in the policy cycle, combining indigenous and academic knowledge showing enhanced adoption of EBA and ownership at multiple scales. Ownership means maintenance of EBA measures and long-term monitoring that will more likely be sponsored at community level. The co-benefits of EBA make EBA cost-effective. If EBA is well communicated, then it shall foster early buy-in, which along with ownership needs to be reinforced along the way. Stakeholder participation at all stages will determine EBA success or failure. Targeting low-hanging fruits for EBA shall pave the way for adopting EBA progressively and enhancing the allocation of public and private funds. Low-hanging fruits and proven concept will bring most immediate gratification to local partners, sponsors, and will bring more political allies. Another message is that EBA requires mid to long-term investment in ecosystem management and restoration. Thus, EBA need locally appropriate metrics and thorough monitoring and evaluation and learning, follow-up and adaptive management strategies to better deal with uncertainty and increase buy-in. So far, this is what we have for the EBA guidelines. It's still a working process, but we have already a very well consolidated set of guidelines that we will review in the upcoming weeks. So thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much to you, Alejandro, for your great work on the guidelines and your dedication to that effort. I would like to welcome everybody who is in the session, panelists, speakers, and participants. Please do direct questions to Alejandro if you have any feedback or questions about the guidelines, anything that you would hope to see in there, anything you think that might be of primary importance for you, or that you think might be missing from what we're currently looking at with those guidelines. But I welcome you to please use the opportunity to provide your feedback and thoughts on that process. We are approaching the end of our session. I welcome and thank everybody for your patience in running a little bit over time today. It has been such a rich discussion with so many inputs from all of you. I welcome you to keep the conversation going here in the chat, here in the Q&A box, and also on the Hubilo platform. We will be sharing the transcript and recording of this session, as well as the conversations in the chat and Q&A sections, the Menti poll results, and the slides that we presented to you today. We'll be sharing that after this session, I believe that will come up on the Hubilo platform. So hopefully everybody is registered there to keep track of what we worked on and what we've talked about today. I would very much like to thank all of our presenters and panelists today for your extremely rich conversations and contributions to the conversation around how we can increase the uptake of nature-based and EVA principles in national adaptation planning. It's been a very rewarding and enriching conversation for myself, and I'm sure for everyone else who's joined us in the session today. I would like to also thank the team at the Global Adaptation Network Secretariat, Anna and Sue. I'd like to thank Inside Pact for your technical support to this session, and everyone who has provided support to this session. Thank you to all. And we'd also like to welcome you to join the next Nature-Based Resilience Stream session on science and assessments that is being co-organized by UNFCCC and Unep. It will be taking place tomorrow from 11:15 until 12:45 p.m. Bangkok time. And this session is going to be focusing on how we address adaptation knowledge gaps to scale up nature-based action through the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative, the LAKI, within the Asia-Pacific region. Please also join us tomorrow at 8:00 a.m. Bangkok time for a special event on UNEP-led Global Adaptation Network organized by the Ministry of Environment Japan and GAN Secretariat. Thank you to all who have joined us today, and we welcome the conversation with you in the coming weeks and months, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Have a good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for key messages of day 2, and then immediately after, we will be having a trivia night. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference community on Hubilo. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions, as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees. Join the conversation on social media using hashtag APAN2020. Thank you once again for your participation, and see you in the next sessions. Goodbye.